And here it is, the Triumph Daytona 955i. This is the 2003 model, and today we're going to be just taking our first look at it. We'll leave all the details and the real riding experience to our review, which will come very soon. But I wanted to give you guys a first look at the bike just to show it off a little bit. And I've had this bike for a day now. I've ridden her for a few hours, and I do have some initial comments that I would like to make about this bike. But she is a lot of fun. Made in Great Britain. One of the last things that is actually made and exported in Britain. Now, this colour black is my preferred colour for this generation of Daytonas. They did have a blue that I was looking at and a red one as well, but I did prefer the black, and in the end the red one was ended up being sold before I had a chance to get my hands on it. But this, honestly, I prefer the text of the Daytona as well, rather than the slightly newer generations, the 2005, 2006. However, let me show you what I mean by a lot of fun. And I am going to be getting a Triumph key badge at some point in the near future. Don't worry, I am working on it. But honestly, my first impressions of this bike actually weren't all that positive at the start. But the more I've gotten to know this bike, the more I actually appreciate it. And arguably, I think this bike is more fun than the ZX9R, which we sold recently. We actually managed to sell it pretty quick. I ended up selling it for £1,300. So I did make a bit of a loss on that bike, considering I had to do the head bearing and all that stuff, which cost me about 200 quid. But this bike, I think, is a little bit more fun than ZX9. I mean, in terms of performance, in terms of specs, they're very similarly matched. This is a 3-cylinder 955cc fuel-injected motorcycle, whereas ZX9 was a 899cc inline 4 that was carburetted. I do like going back to a fuel-injected motorcycle. I do tend to prefer fuel-injected bikes over carburetted ones, but I mean, it's just personal preference really. It doesn't make much difference in terms of performance or usability of the bike, but you don't have to worry about cleaning carbs or balancing carbs or things like that. This is all computerized and automatic as far as I'm aware. Maybe there is some maintenance that needs to be done on the throttle bodies every once in a while, but what we'll do, we'll get out onto the main road and get away from this little truck here that's pulling along some farm livestock. And yeah, I'll give you a little bit more information about this bike. I mean, that dog being up there doesn't look that secure. Woo! Yeah, what's funny is that I picked this bike up. There's a doggy. I picked this bike up and it was about a couple of hours away from where we live, but we were visiting family in the area, so we thought, well, we'll go and check this one out. And it was a good price. I paid £1,850 for it, £1,850, and I didn't actually like it at first. I did the test ride, everything was fine with the bike, so I was like, well, I've come all the way here, might as well buy it. And the long journey that I did on the way back home with this bike, I didn't enjoy. This is arguably the most uncomfortable motorcycle I've ever ridden. And that's saying something, because most of the bikes I've had are super sports, but this one is difficult in terms of ergonomics. And they describe this bike as the gentleman's sport bike, but I don't know why, because I would have expected that to be a little bit more comfortable than this. But you're leaning really far forward over the tank, and the tank does seem massive as well. It looks absolutely huge. Then I got it home, had a bit of a break, and then took it out again for another ride on our local roads, and I had an absolute blast on this bike. And this thing, man, it will it redlines at 11,500 RPM, but it actually produces more horsepower at redline than it does below its redline. It's quite incredible. And it is geared quite long as well. First gear, I think I was able to get it up to 75 mile an hour. So it is geared fairly long, but it doesn't have that much power under 4,000 RPM, but once you get above 5, oh, this bike comes alive. And this model is a little bit rickety and it's not that well refined, but when you start getting into those higher RPMs, it runs brilliantly. And I have taken a bit of a risk with this one. It's got 27,500 miles, 2003, so it is an old bike, and it's done a fair amount of miles, but I don't think it's too bad. I think there's enough life left in this bike for myself and at least one other owner after I've sold this bike in about a year's time. Oh god, bug went right to my face. Missed the helmet, went straight through the visor. Nice, okay. But the pickup, the throttle pickup, isn't that great at lower RPMs. But I'm telling you right now, this thing absolutely loves to redline. Now there are some speed cameras around here, so I've got to be careful, but yeah, this bike absolutely loves being over 10,000 RPM. That's where it's happiest, and it revs out really well. It's at about 9 or 10, 11,000 RPM is when you start pulling wheelies on this bike in first gear. It is very well planted to the ground. I am thinking about maybe getting an aftermarket sprocket set that is geared a little bit shorter, so I can get a little bit more torque out of it and make it a bit more wheelie prone. That's what I'd like to do to this bike. I don't know if I will, but we do have some mods that are on the way, and yeah, well, we'll see if that transforms this bike, if it makes it a bit more lively. And I mean, I say that this is a very lively bike. When you're cruising on it, it's not that fun, to be honest with you. But it's when you get it up in those RPMs is when this bike becomes a load of fun. Seriously, really good fun. Yeah, had a little bit of a race encounter with this bike as well. The first day that I got her home, where I raced a couple of BMW 1 Series 3 litre. It's the straight 6 variants. Those are fast cars, man. They can do 0 to 60, I think, in about 4.5 seconds. They are quick cars, but this is quicker. And yeah, very comparable to the ZX9, but one thing I will comment on is, even though this bike I think is a little bit heavier than the 9, it's actually nimbler. This is actually would make the perfect track bike. And I don't know if it's because of the single-sided swing arm, but the back end of the bike feels so light to move around. Yeah, this thing is incredibly nimble. Flicking it into the bends is honestly an absolute dream. I was a little bit worried about the single swing arm setup, but you know, I actually do like the feel of this bike in a lot of ways, so I'm not going to complain about it too much. When it comes to maintaining it, well, chain maintenance and stuff like that, and well, chain adjustment, chain tension, then maybe at that point it might start becoming a bit more of a pain, but but these bikes, you can get them all day for anywhere from 2,000 to 2,500 pounds with relatively low miles, well, under 30,000 miles, and in pretty good condition. The physical condition of this bike is impeccable. it's in better condition than the ZX9 was when I bought that. That thing had scrapes everywhere and what have you, but I did pay £1,500 for that bike, so you know, you do pay for what you get. But these bikes are a little bit more of a premium over the ZX9. But honestly, when I first got this bike, I didn't think it was worth it, but actually right now, I genuinely think that this bike is worth it. But there are a few problems. So, both the tyres, I think, are going to need replacing. The front tyre wasn't advisory on the last MOT, so that one definitely needs replacing. But the rear tyre is close as well, in my opinion. So, I'm going to have to pick up some new tyres for this bike, which are probably going to cost about 200 quid, I imagine, for a pair. But that is why I did get a bit of a discount off the asking price. The asking price was £2,000. They gave me a bit of money off for the tyre. Woo! But physical condition is really good. Now the fuel tank isn't metal, it's plastic. So, and over time, if the bike sits and you've got petrol sitting in the tank for a long time without actually riding the bike, you're starting to get a little bit of bubbling on the tank. I did ask the guy I bought it from, he was a dealer actually, if it would be straightforward enough to repaint, but to respray, but he said no, not really. You have to sand it all the way back to the bare plastic, the raw plastic, and then paint over that. So that might be a bit of a chore, and there are bubbles everywhere on this tank, on the top, on the sides. They're not that noticeable, but they are there. And it's unfortunate because this bike cosmetically is absolutely perfect. It doesn't look like it's ever been dropped at all. Everything is in really good cosmetic condition. But this bike was sat around for a little bit as well. Its last MOT before this year was back in 2021, so in 2022 it basically hadn't been ridden for 2 years. Woo! Fun bike. But yeah, this is actually a far sportier motorcycle than I was expecting, considering how it had been described when I was doing my research beforehand. Yeah. Honestly, this would be a track day beast. This thing is more nimble than a 600, despite the fact that it's heavier. This thing is going to have more power than a 600. It's going to... It will give 1000s a run for their money, I'm telling you now. It's got a lovely amount of torque. Not in the lower end RPMs, granted, but yeah, above 5,000 or 6,000 RPM. That's where you want to be with this bike. Yeah, really good. I'm having a lot of fun on this bike, more fun than I thought I would have when I first bought it. When I first bought it, it felt quite samey to the ZX9 in a lot of ways, but it had a rougher running engine for the most part. The ZX9's engine is very smooth, very refined, whereas these aren't so much. But I found that that's really only in the lower RPMs, and there is issues with these bikes. One, they're on a semi-warm startup or a cold startup, where they do tend to run a little bit rough at the start, but then you give them 10 seconds or so and they sort themselves out. So I was reading in forums that most riders simply just live with it, but I suppose you could adjust the fueling or something like that on startup if you really wanted to, which I might do with this bike. I don't know. You can get a remap of this bike as well. You can get it flashed, the ECU, so that'll be something that we could look at to get a little bit more horsepower out of it. I don't know. But one other little thing about this bike, one other little tidbit, is the exhaust does hang really low. I've actually scraped it already a couple of times on speed bumps. So I was looking at maybe getting an aftermarket full exhaust system for this bike, but I didn't really find much that would solve that issue. So I don't know, maybe that's a red herring there, but all in all, I mean, this is a really fun bike. And I know that there were some Aprilias I could have looked at, there was the Street Triple I could have looked at, there was some Yamahas as well, there was a few R1s. Oh, well then again, but we weren't looking at Japanese bikes, were we? It was a Eurobike challenge, of course, I forget. But honestly, like £3,000 actually is a lot for a Eurobike challenge. I did have a look at Street Triples, but I did have a test ride of a Street Triple recently, and it was a newer one, it was 2014. Again, geared very long, but it didn't have a lot of horsepower. Even at the upper end RPMs, it didn't have a lot, which I was a little bit disappointed by. It's a really comfortable bike and it sounded amazing, but didn't have a lot of torque, whereas these days I do like torque on my bikes, and the only way you're going to get torque is with bikes of this caliber, to be honest. Yeah, a lot of fun, this bike. And I mean, there are lots of options. There are even a few Ducati monsters that we could have looked at. There's a lot of options out there, but when it comes to Euro bikes, Triumph, I have a bit of a soft spot for Triumph, not only because they're made in the UK, but because this very bike featured in Mission Impossible 2, the villain in that movie, and I absolutely love that movie. Yeah, the villain was riding a red 955 Daytona, and ever since I saw the Speed Triple rather, and the Daytona in that movie, I've always wanted to buy one of these bikes, and now I have one. So maybe one day we'll have a look at a Speed Triple again, but maybe one of the 1050cc Speed Triples. But I heard in forums that this is just a little bit better because it has forged pistons, and that's how it's able to produce that top end horsepower, as the Speed Triple isn't. Torque tops out at 5,500 RPM, at least for this generation anyway, the 955 generation. But yeah, there's something about this bike that I wanted more than the Speed Triple, and it doesn't take anything away from the Speed Triple. I think at some point I'm going to look forward to having a go on that bike and see if it has a little bit more punch than this bike does. I hope it does. I hope it's a little bit more torquey, or built for torque rather than horsepower. That's naked should be. But this thing, man, this is a lot of fun, and it does get hot. You know, it quite easily hovers around 105 degrees Celsius on a really warm day. When I picked this bike up, it was a really warm day, 30 odd degrees C. Oh, this bike, yeah. It's funny because the sport bikes of this era, they do tend to produce more torque than newer super sports, the 1000cc super sports, their equivalent today. But the fact that you get torque really low down in the range is so nice for street riding. You don't really see that an awful lot on a lot of super sports these days. So yeah, I really love this bike, and I hope that you appreciate the choice that I made for today's video. And thank you ever so much for watching this one. Thank you for joining me on this ride today. You let me know what you think down in the comment section below about the Triumph Daytona 955i. And as always, go ahead, leave that like, hit that subscribe button and that notification bell so you don't miss any more of our videos on the Triumph motorcycles going forward. And we'll catch you all in the next video, everyone. Take care, ride safe.